Sit in a seat. So if those of you who are young and spry and can do Ardha Padma Asana would like to take a little place on the floor, that might free up a little bit more space for us to accommodate a few more people. And I'd like to welcome you all. My name is Chapple, and I'm the Doshi Professor of Indic and Comparative Theology. I'm also the director of the Master of Arts in Yoga Studies. And we're so delighted to welcome you once more to Loyola Marymount University. And we have a beautiful evening planned. And as you can see from the program, we have a few people that will say a couple of words. We're going to present an award to Dr. Sheldrake. He will speak. He will be followed by some commentary from Dr. Hagelin, who is here from Maharishi International University. And then we will also hear from our very own Eric Strauss, who is Distinguished Professor of Biology and the Center for Urban Resilience here at LMU. And I would like first to introduce our Dean of the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts, Dr. Robbin Crabtree.
Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts at Loyola Marymount University, I'd like to welcome everyone to this signature event, which celebrates the creative and productive interplay of faith and reason, which, as many of you know, is a foundational principle in Catholic and Jesuit education. I'd particularly like to welcome, and I'm so pleased to see so many members of communities from outside the university come to our campus for this kind of event. And a special welcome to our special guests, the Doshi family, and also our guests from the Maharishi Institute. I'm happy to see that there are students present, undergraduate and graduate students, as well as faculty and staff from across the university. As most of you probably know, Loyola Marymount University is a place that encourages, facilitates, and creates a welcoming context for vibrant interreligious dialogue. We're very grateful for the generosity and the vision of Navin and Pratima Doshi, who founded the Doshi Family Bridgebuilder Award at LMU, and it contributes so importantly to our manifestation of this characteristic in our institution. Through the Doshi Family Bridgebuilder Award, we're able to honor together each year an individual or organization that's demonstrated a unique and sustained dedication to fostering the understanding between cultures, peoples, and discipline. It's very apropos to Los Angeles, and when we look around the room, we see that it is a goal that resonates. This award and its honorees animate and extend this university's mission in important ways. And as the new dean of the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts, I'm very pleased to see the many ways that the award, its founders, and its honorees manifest the values and advance the goals that we see as part of a liberal arts education in the Jesuit and Marymount traditions. I want to give my personal congratulations to our honoree tonight, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who joins really quite a remarkable list of prior honorees such as Deepak Chopra, Thich Nhat Hanh, and Vandana Shiva, among others. Come on, that's very impressive. Dr. Sheldrake's work inspires us to approach our lives and to think about our actions in the world with equal parts rigorous accountability and profound awe. And I think, what could be more Ignatian than that? So welcome to everybody. Enjoy the evening.
Hey, Mr. Doshi, known to many of you here, landed in Los Angeles a few decades ago, and he very thoughtfully discovered all that's wonderful about California, and very thoughtfully has dedicated decades to allowing the interface to take place between Asian culture, North American culture, between the realm of science and the realm of spirituality. And he will introduce our key speaker as well as offer some considered questions. So I welcome Navin, please, to come and speak.
Good evening, friends, and welcome. A very special thanks to wonderful friends that I have in this audience. I can't give all the names. I want to certainly thank my very good friend, Michael Bush, who was able to convince Dr. John Hagelin to be here. So we're going to have a very interesting discussion. And I'm going to bore you for about 8 to 9 minutes with my questions. I even thought that if my son was here, he would probably read my speech. So you have to bear with me, my accent, whatever flaws that I have in my speech. One of the poignant quotes of Professor Houston Smith, a recipient of year 2011 Bridgebuilder Award, is, and I quote him, "Institutions are not pretty. Show me a pretty government. Healing is wonderful, but the American Medical Association, question mark. Learning is wonderful, but universities, oh, there is one exception, LMU. The same is true for religion. Religion is institutionalized spirituality. Apparently, the field of science is also institutionalized. Hard boundaries are drawn based upon bias and beliefs. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake has categorized 10 of them in his most recent book, Set Science Free. I wholeheartedly agree with him and would like to comment on 4 of them supporting his critique through the lens of Indic traditions. 1, the laws of nature are fixed, not true according to Indic tradition. Prakriti, meaning nature, is always changing. It is never absolute. When materialists build walls around science, evolution stops. Science can never be complete, since every law needs to be kept in check as we gain more knowledge and experience. Number 2, nature is purposeless, and evolution has no goal or direction. Again, not true. There is an important insight about light. I call it a link between Purusha and Prakriti. Light is a beam of photon particles or package of energy. We do not see light. Light helps us to see and discover everything in nature. Light, therefore, in every sense of the word, is seen and at much higher level of mind enlightening. Light is a pure action with purpose, and it is attached to nothing. It is light that came down to create matter, energy, space, time. And all of us in this audience. And yes, we all have purpose in our lives. Number 3, mind is inside head. Again, not true. Mind has no location in space-time continuum. Mind, as I understand, is linked to all-pervading consciousness. We could call it a quantum or morphic connection. Number 4, materialists also believe in upward possession, meaning they believe the primary or primacy of matter over mind and equate it to consciousness. Eastern tradition believes in downward position, where consciousness, that is Brahma, is the highest state of being, followed by the mind and the body, that is matter. There are many more beliefs in the West that, at least to me, seems to be irrational. Even today, when you Google to find the origin of zero, you will be surprised that several sites do not acknowledge India, though United Nations has declared it to be India. Archaeologists have proven, using modern technology, including genetics, that there was no alien invasion or migration for the last 30,000 years in India. However, they will keep teaching the alien invasion theory in schools, both in USA and in India. There is a war going on between materialists like Richard Dawkins, the author of Selfish Gene, and idealists like our guest, our recipient of the award, Rupert Sheldrake, and John Hagelin, also internationally known authors. Fortunately, there are more joining the ranks of idealists, but unfortunately, the materialist controls the purse, as it happened during Galileo's time when the Roman Catholic Church was controlling the purse. The church never accepted Galileo's heliocentrism, meaning planets revolving around the sun. He was persecuted and put under house arrest. Today, things are reversed. We are having this discussion in LMU, a Catholic university, welcoming an open mind, breaking the unnatural boundaries. We have two scientists in this gathering, Dr. Sheldrake, a biologist, and Dr. Hagelin, a physicist, who I compare them with Darwin and Galileo, to break the boundaries, to go beyond. In some ways, they are freedom fighters, like Gandhi and King, who fight to free the domain of philosophy from the shackles of hard materialism. I, as a student of life, wish to describe my understanding of our existence, and please correct me, my gurus of sciences, wherever you find flaws, please find it and let me understand. The work of a few physicists who are in the world of the idealism implies an affirmation of the Vedantic tradition that there is an ultimate self-consciousness or self-conscious reality. This reality is the world and the cosmos we live in. It is also the consciousness that contains and penetrates the cosmos in totality. This ultimate reality is, subjectively speaking, an infinite bliss, and objectively speaking, an infinite in any quality and value that expresses and experiences itself. This follows the top-down framework of Vedantic kind, with quality and consciousness rooted in the very heart of reality. I also interpret that there is non-local, meaning beyond the realm of perceivable space and time, quantum connection between individual subjective consciousness and the all-pervading objective superconsciousness. It also has been accepted that the nature within and without is fractal, meaning it is layered like an onion. The implication here is that not only our body and mind, but consciousness itself is layered and has discrete voices rising toward greater consciousness and wholeness. Sri Aurobindo had pioneered this subject and claimed that humanity is on the evolutionary path of transcendence towards the ultimate reality. Morphic field, as I understand, implies collective memories within species, is inherited, and the field establishes interconnectedness. We know we have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. The world population is about 8 billion. When we multiply 233 times, the number is larger than 8 billion. The implication here is that any of us are at least 33rd cousin of any other person. So we are all connected. genetically. We know that nature is layered. So are we. My body is the undergarment of the garment I'm wearing. When all the layers are removed, what remains is at the deepest level is Atman, the indivisible self-perception of Brahman. Atman is identical in all of us. So we are identical at the deepest level. Resonance implies being in tune. Can morphic resonance, under certain conditions, unify humanity just as resonance does in an optical laser, when photons spontaneously conform into a fine, non-divergent, one-color beam of light. Vedic Pandits at Maharishi universities are chanting en masse to create an environment for peace. Could it be possible, or could it possibly create a unified morphic resonance among all of us at the deepest level? Could it create paths to transcend towards becoming realized Superman that Aurobindo, Maharishi, and Nietzsche describe? So, friends, Dr. Sheldrake, it does not matter how you grade me, but this evening you are the man of the hour, receiving this year's Bridgebuilder Award. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to invite Dr. Sheldrake and Dr. Crabtree to come up, and we're going to jointly present this very lovely image. There is a staircase, but that's okay. We're a little non-local here. And when I was given the choice, I said, this is the one. Because it's round like the globe, it's crystalline, and it's clear. And what we appreciate so much about the innovative work of Dr. Sheldrake all of these years is that he invites us to shine, to see connectivity, and to allow ourselves to move into that space where we truly resonate with one another as human beings. And like so many of these bridge builders, we're just so glad to have you with us today. And this is the second part.
Now, I want to just say one more line. This event, without the great lady Dana, without you, it would not, Dana Gray, it would not have happened.
Thank you very much. I am very honored by this, and I very much appreciate this award. In fact, receiving this award has made me look back over my life and see it in a new way. I've been reading Navin Doshi's book, Transcendence, which is full of many words of wisdom. And one of the themes, of course, is bridge building. Another related theme is polarity, pairs of opposites, which occur in many aspects of human life, social life, and in nature. And as a result of knowing I was getting this reward and reading his book, I've actually looked back over my life and it's come into a completely new focus. And so I thought that would be the best thing I could do to respond to this, to make some personal reflections on my own experiences and on my own research. I don't normally talk about myself, but this seems to be a moment when I can indulge in something about my personal history. The first thing that occurred to me in relation to this bridge building theme is that throughout my life, I've been drawn to people, attracted to people, and very influenced by people who were bridge builders. I'd never seen it that way before. But when I look back, I find that this is a recurrent theme, going back from my earliest childhood. When I was a child, the first bridge builder in my life was my father. He was scientifically trained. He was a herbalist and a pharmacist. Part of his bridge building was between traditional herbalism, which came out of a long tradition in England, as it does in other countries, and modern scientific pharmacy. He did both. And of the two, he was probably more interested in the herbs, but he was interested in the bridge between them. He was interested in the bridge between science, as known through more abstract studies, and natural history, what you see in nature. Next to my bedroom, he had a microscope laboratory and introduced me to the mysteries of the microscopic world from an early age. And he was also a bridge builder between the realms of science and religion. Both my parents were devout Methodists. My mother was probably more devout than my father, but he took very seriously his religious faith and saw no conflict between that and his scientific interests. He was also very musical. All my family are musical, and there was again no conflict between science and religion and music. They were seen as complementary. So I grew up in an environment where forming these connections seemed to me normal and natural. I went to a boarding school, a boys' boarding school, an old-style, traditional boys' boarding school in England. And there I had a teacher to whom I was very drawn. He was my biology teacher, also my housemaster. And he was a man who himself was a bridge builder. He was a musician as well as a biologist. He'd come from a Quaker background and was interested in mythology and philosophy, and used to talk to me late at night. When it was lights out time in the dormitory, once or twice a week, I would sit and talk to him in his study for hours. And he introduced me to the works of Robert Graves and Sir James Frazer, The Golden Bough, and Jung and Freud, and enormously expanded my perspectives. But what particularly reminded me of him when I was reading Navin's book, Transcendence, is that the thing he came back to over and over again was that human beings are engaged in a process of seeking for unity. There was a unity-seeking tendency in the human mind and indeed in nature. And this was his primary teaching to me. And this is one of the primary teachings of Navin's book. I went to Cambridge, where I studied natural sciences. And in Cambridge, the college system is based on medieval monasteries. My own college, Birk College, was founded in 1326. And the colleges at Cambridge contain people from all different subjects. They're not specialized in one field. So among my fellow undergraduates, there were people studying languages, classics, theology, science, arts subjects of various kinds. And so every evening at dinner in the college hall, there were conversations that cut across disciplines. This is one of the great strengths of the Oxford and Cambridge college system. One of my friends was studying German literature and introduced me to the works of Goethe, the great German poet and scientist. And again, I was immediately drawn to Goethe. I read Goethe's works, especially those on science, on colour and on plants, with enormous interest. And what Goethe was saying was that there shouldn't be a gulf between nature and our intellectual understanding of nature and our experience of nature. That when we understand plants, for example, and I was studying botany, that when we study plants, our scientific understanding of the plant should inform the way we actually see the plant when we look at the plant. I love that because so much of the science that was going on in biology at Cambridge didn't involve looking at living organisms. The first thing you did with an organism you were studying was to kill it and grind it up. and so I'd gone into biology because I loved living organisms. I kept lots of pets as a child. I collected plants. But the first thing we did with everything was to kill it. And Goethe was saying, no, you should look at the living plant and actually understand its growth. In fact, this vision that he portrayed of a holistic science was so at variance with the extremely reductionist science that was the vogue when I was an undergraduate and still is, that I doubted whether I wanted to go on to do science at all. I had assumed, and everyone had assumed, that I would go on to do scientific research. I was very good at it. I got very high marks. I got university prizes. But then I thought, do I really want to do this? Do I want to spend my life killing organisms and chopping things up? So I then had another sort of bridge-building type opportunity. I saw a notice in Cambridge advertising a fellowship at Harvard, where they're giving a one-year fellowship in the graduate school at Harvard. And I thought, what I really want to do is study history and philosophy of science, so I can see how science fits in, why mechanistic biology, this extremely reductionist approach to life, has got to be the way it is, and whether it has to be like that or whether things can be different. While I was at Harvard, it was soon after Thomas Kuhn's famous book had just come out, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, about paradigms and paradigm changes. I realized that the mechanistic theory in biology was a paradigm, and that paradigms could change. This gave me a whole inspiration for the possibility of a new science. I went back to Cambridge to do research on plants. I was originally going to work on animals, but I didn't like the idea of killing animals for the rest of my life. So I worked on plants. I didn't like killing plants particularly, but I did console myself with the thought that even vegans eat lettuce leaves. That experience at Harvard, where I was able to range over philosophy and science and history, was something that I found immensely stimulating and inspiring and helpful. When I got back to Cambridge and was doing research on plants and their development of plants, I was approached by somebody, a friend of mine, who introduced me to a group of people who became, as it were, my main intellectual stimulus for years in Cambridge, a group called the Epiphany Philosophers. They were named after an Anglican monastery, the Community of the Epiphany. And it was a strange, eccentric and disparate group of people. It included the professor of philosophy, Richard Braithwaite, a great expert on the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, Dorothy Emmett, who had studied with him, Margaret Masterman, who ran the language research unit at Cambridge, and a variety of other people. There were hippies, people doing martial arts, there were Anglican monks, there were Buddhists, there were meditators, people doing Tai Chi, people into alternative medicine. And 4 times a year we lived together as a community in an old windmill on the coast of Norfolk. We had discussions and seminars about the areas between science, philosophy, and spirituality. And this group published a journal which came out for about 10 years called Theoria to Theory. Utterly obscure title. Never reached the bestseller lists. It always had a small but dedicated readership. And what it was about bridge building. Theoria is the Greek word that means intuitive or mystical experience. Theory is intellectual theory, as in science. And two, not the letter two, but the T-O, two. What this was about was the making a bridge between the realms of intuitive and mystical experience and rational scientific theory. And the powerhouse of this group was Margaret Masterman. And her vision was that the conflict between science and spirituality, if there was a conflict, showed that there was something wrong with science. And this was very different from the usual view in liberal theology at the time. There was an attempt to chop down and demythologize religion more and more, so that whenever it conflicted or even might conflict with science, more and more was pared away until you got sort of very minimalist kind of theological view. She took the view, and the whole group did really, that the mechanistic and materialist model in science had gone seriously wrong, and that what was needed was something more inclusive and more holistic. We had these seminars for these meetings for many years, and they were always exciting They were often involved conflicts and arguments. Some people in the group were very bad-tempered, and particularly Professor Braithwaite, who often reduced people to tears. But what we had, because it was a Christian group, every morning we said matins, the Anglican form of matins. We dressed up in white robes in the top room of the windmill. And it started with a moment, a ceremony I used to dread called the Chapter of Faults. And we went round in order of age after singing some psalms in plain chant. And each person in order of age had to say, apologise for things they'd done to upset people in the previous day. It was usually things like not doing their share of the washing up. It wasn't about deep existential crises. And then at the end of it, you had to say, if anyone has anything else to remind me of, I'd be grateful to be told. That was a moment when explosions occurred. But it did mean that the tensions within the group were healed on a daily basis, and this otherwise very disparate group with very different ideas could hang together and work together, and by praying together. So the Epiphany philosophers were a very major part of my time at Cambridge, and the whole group was a bridge-building group, as I said. I then took a job in India. I worked as principal plant physiologist at the International Crops Research Institute for the Semi-Arid Tropics, ICRISAT, in Hyderabad. And that was obviously a huge change, going from a life as a don in Cambridge, living in 17th century rooms with dinner on the high table every night, and wonderful cellars full of claret and port and so on, to living in Hyderabad and working in field biology in an agricultural institute. I loved being in India. The reason I took the job there was I was very drawn to India. I had already, although an atheist at the time, taken up transcendental meditation because I was very attracted by the idea of changing one's mind through such a simple practice as saying a mantra for 20 minutes a day. I was also doing some yoga, and I got interested in Indian philosophy, and that was a big inspiration for me to go to India. I'd travelled in India before that, and I felt completely at home there. So taking a job in India, working in a scientific institute, an international institute, but embedded within Indian life, was, for me, a most wonderful period of my life. I enjoyed the culture of Hyderabad very much, the Hindu culture and the Sufi culture. There were some wonderful Sufis in Hyderabad that used to sing this devotional music, Qawwali, at dargahs, shrines of saints, and I was very attracted to that too. For a while I had a Sufi teacher who became a great friend. But after 2 or 3 years, I realized that actually my own tradition was something that was calling me back, and at school I became an atheist at age 14 because I went with the scientific education, but I felt drawn back to a Christian path. I was confirmed in the Church of South India, which again is a bridge-building church, a fusion of Methodists and Anglicans, in my 30s. But I found the Christian path, although very important to me, left out an understanding and appreciation of aspects of the Indian tradition that I found very important. Most Indian Christians weren't interested in the Vedas and the Upanishads and so on. And it was at that stage I met the star bridge builder in my life, Father E. Griffiths, who had an ashram in South India, an English Benedictine monk, who lived in a small Christian ashram in South India. He wore the orange robes of the sannyasi. In the ashram, the services involved chanting and Tamil devotional singing, Sanskrit chanting. There was 2 hours of meditation a day in the morning and the evening, and yoga. And this ashram was a great centre of interreligious dialogue, and not just talking about it, but doing it. And when I first went there, I was astonished that this was possible. This was a Roman Catholic ashram. Soon after I first went there, the Mass in the morning, the celebration of the Holy Eucharist, began with the chanting of the Gayatri mantra. And so I said to Father B, how can you possibly have the Gayatri mantra, this invocation for the divine splendor of the sun to illuminate our meditation? Now, how can you possibly have this Gayatri mantra, this Hindu mantra, in a Catholic ashram? And he said, precisely because it's a Catholic ashram. He said Catholic means universal, and if it doesn't include all valid paths to God, it's not universal, it's a sect. And so I said this extraordinarily broad vision that Father Bede had was an enormous inspiration to me. And my first book, A New Science of Life, in which I put forward the idea of morphic resonance, was written in his ashram and is dedicated to him. So, I think perhaps the next bridge building event, as I'm going through this series of major bridge building events and people in my life, happened in Bombay in 1982. I was invited, I was working in Hyderabad, it was the crop season, I was busy with the harvest of the chickpea and pigeon pea crops, and I got a letter, a handwritten letter from Stan Roth from the Esalen Institute in California, and I'd never been to California, saying, would I go to this conference on ancient wisdom and modern science in Bombay? And it was hard for me to go because we were very busy in the field. But I took a couple of days off to go to Bombay on the train and went to this conference. It was mainly people from California. It was a strange collection of people I've never met before. But one key bridge building event that happened there was, as I gave my talk on modern science, I went to a talk given by a young woman on ancient wisdom, on creative tension and polarities and their creative effect. And that young woman was Jill Peirce, who soon after became my wife. She's with us here this evening. And Jill has a Tibetan teacher, Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche, from the Dzogchen tradition. So in our home, we have combined the practice of Christianity. We both go to our local parish church. With Jill's Tibetan practices, she teaches chanting and meditation based not just on Tibetan, but on Hindu and Christian and Sufi and other traditions. So when I got back to, when my book came out, when I first came to California in 1982, I had a strange time. And I started off in Los Angeles, and I'd never been to California before. My publisher, Jeremy Tarcher, invited me to stay with him in Beverly Hills. And so I was plunged right into California in the most extreme way. His wife, Sherry Lewis, had a puppet called Lamb Chop. So I was staying in Beverly Hills with Lamb Chop and Sherry and Jeremy, and they put me up in their guest house in the garden. And so I went to bed at night, and I had a terrible night. Within about 10 minutes, I was feeling seasick. Every time I moved, the thing sort of went like this. So I had to sleep on the floor. And so in the morning he said, how did you sleep? And I said, well, frankly, not very well. And I said, I felt seasick, and I can't understand why. He said, and Sherry said, oh, that's a waterbed. Anyway, so when I came to California, I got an invitation from Ojai to go and stay with Krishnamurti. And Krishnamurti very much liked the idea of morphic resonance. And I held a series of dialogues there with him and David Bohm, the physicist. So again, another bridge building exercise in California. And that became an important link for me, the bridges between biology and physics. I had many other conversations with David Bohm over the years, and he was a great help and friend and supporter in my work, because he felt morphic resonance was very compatible with his interpretation of quantum physics. And with Krishnamurti himself, we became great friends, and for several years we were traveling around the world more or less in phase. When I was in India working in Ikrisat, I then went down to Madras, and he was at Adyar, at his centre there, so we did dialogues in Adyar. Sometimes on the way to Hyderabad, I was in Delhi, and he was staying with Prubal Jayakar in Delhi, and we used to have dialogues at her house in Delhi. Then when I was in England, he was at Rockwood Park, and we used to talk there, and then when I was in California, he was at Ojai. So for several years, Krishnamurti and I, for reasons that I didn't plan my schedule to move around his and vice versa, but we just were in this coinciding in this annual migration movement. And I had many stimulating discussions with him, and that was a kind of another bridge building exercise, and it was great fun. Since then, I became friends with Matthew Fox, the theologian, and he and I have had many meetings over the years. We presented several workshops together, and we've written 2 books together. One is Natural Grace, Dialogues on Science and Spirituality. The other is a book which is being reissued next week called The Physics of Angels, exploring the realm where science and spirit meet. In it, we discuss the idea that there may be many forms of consciousness in the universe, including the consciousness of the sun, the stars, the entire galaxy. And we see how this relates to traditional ideas in the Christian tradition from Dionysius the Areopagite, St. Thomas Aquinas, and Hildegard of Bingen, whose ideas on the angels were, of course, not of men with wings, as in stained glass windows, but of intelligences and guiding spirits in the universe that work through the natural world and through people. But some of them were the intelligences of the stars. So if we start thinking about intelligence in nature, then these traditions that we have already in our Christian tradition are very important. And that book, as I say, will be coming out very soon. And I've also been following on explorations of science and spirituality with other people. 10 days ago at the Esalen Institute, I co-led a workshop with the Bishop of California, Mark Andrews from Grace Cathedral, the Episcopalian bishop, who's a great friend. And we had a wonderful time there. There's some people here who were at that event. So this is an ongoing part of my life. To see all this in perspective, I just thought of these as things I do, but I hadn't seen the recurrent bridge-building theme running through it all until inspired by the existence of this award. I want to say a few words about my scientific work, because my scientific work, right from the beginning, has been on polarity. For my PhD thesis, I was working on the way in which the plant hormone auxin is synthesized in plants. No one knew how it was made. And what I discovered was that this hormone that gives growth and life in plants is actually produced by death. It's produced by dying cells. And as plants grow, cells within them commit suicide. The wood cells in the trunk of a tree, called xylem cells, the cells thicken up their walls, they dissolve the ends, they turn themselves into thickened tubes, and then the cell commits suicide. And these become the little tubes which sap goes up from the roots to the shoots. As leaves grow, the veins of the leaves contain these xylem cells. So as the leaves grow in all the growing parts of the plant, new wood cells are forming. As they die, they break down their proteins. As the proteins break down, they release the amino acids. One of those, tryptophan, is easily degraded to form auxin. It's a breakdown product of dying cells. We produce auxin. We produce as much per day, per weight, excreted in our urine as plants do, but it does nothing in animals. Dying animal cells produce auxin. Dying yeast cells produce auxin. In plants, death within the plant has become something that causes new life to occur. That led me to an interest in dying cells within plants and within animals. And I came up with a theory of aging and death, a general theory of aging and death, which was published in Nature, called The Aging, Growth and Death of Cells, in which I showed that in all cells, as they get older, as they age, there are breakdown products that accumulate they can't get rid of. So there's a build-up of junk in the cell, and some of it is harmful. It's just, this is kind of thermodynamics at work. The cells can't get rid of it. So why don't all cells just senesce and die out? Well, the answer turns out to be that what they do is they divide unequally, so that one cell gets all the rubbish, or most of it, and the other cell is regenerated. The slate is wiped clean. This is how stem cells work. The stem cells that give rise to your skin, under the skin, And every time it divides, it gets a skin cell which dies and finally flakes off. But the stem cell is regenerated. The same for the cells that give rise to red blood cells and to white blood cells. And the stem cells in general have this capacity. And in plants, in the growing tips, meristematic cells, the ones that are in the growing shoots, do the same. One is regenerated and goes on to divide again. The other one becomes part of the bark or one of the leaves or part of or a xylem cell and eventually dies. It turns out the same applies to the most regenerated cell of all within the body, namely the egg cell. When eggs are formed, the egg cell has to be the source of new life, and it has to be completely fresh, regenerated, ready to give a whole new organism. And as egg cells are formed from egg mother cells in animals and plants, there's two cell divisions given by the process of meiosis that you'll remember from biology, if you've done biology. And three of those cells just die, and you get one gleaming, glistening, regenerated egg cell. The mortality of those cells, they pay the price for the regeneration of the egg cell. So this polarity of life and death within animals and plants became one of my major themes. I then worked on the mechanism of polar auxin transport, how auxin is moved from the shoots towards the roots. The polarity of plants is, of course, the polarity of roots and shoots, like a magnet. And like the opposites of which Navin writes in his book, these are not opposing. The whole is made up of poles which are included within a larger field. And the polarity of auxin transport was, I worked out with my colleague Philip Rupert the mechanism of this process. And this became part of standard textbook plant physiology and molecular biology. We worked out there was a particular protein that was the carrier. We worked out where it was, what it did. It's now been isolated. The genes have been cloned. You can actually see these proteins in cells under the microscope with green fluorescent protein attached to it. So that was to do with polarity. And of course my work in India with crops was the plants are inherently polar. The root and shoot leaves are polar, opposing polarity is the base of the leaf, the tip, the left and the right side, the top and the bottom. These pairs of polarities are the essence. As I thought about development, I realized that these fields of polarity must be fields, just like magnetic fields are fields. The whole of the field holds the polarities together in a larger whole. And I got interested in the idea of morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields, an idea first proposed in the 1920s, and became convinced that in plants and animals, these invisible fields shape the developing organism, the embryo or the growing plant. But then the question was, how are they inherited? And that's when I came up with the idea of morphic resonance, which is a kind of memory in nature. Similar things influence other similar things across space and time. If you train rats to learn a new trick in Los Angeles, rats all over the world will learn the same thing quicker, straight away. If you train them today, tomorrow, all over the world, rats will do it quicker. There's already experimental evidence for this surprising and controversial idea. Much of my life over the last 20 or 30 years has been spent testing for this morphic resonance and developing these ideas. When I had this idea at Cambridge, it didn't go over too well with my scientific colleagues. And I found that they were utterly unfamiliar with the idea there could be a memory in nature. I'm saying nature has a memory, the laws of nature are more like habits. It's not all governed by fixed laws that were there at the moment of the Big Bang. This was an alien idea to people in Cambridge, and it's an alien idea to Western science. But when I went to India and discussed it with my colleagues at ICRISAT and other Indian scientists I met, I got the exactly opposite response. Instead of saying, you can't think this, it's ridiculous, it's rubbish, they said, oh, there is nothing new in this idea. Ancient rishis have said this thousands of years ago. And I found that indeed in both Hindu and Buddhist thought, the idea of a kind of memory in nature is very deeply embedded through karma and through the Theosophists took this argument with their idea of the Akashic record. So I found that I had the opposite problem in India. People said, we know this already, why waste time doing experiments? Just one other area of bridge building in science I would like to mention is that as I thought about the increasingly dogmatic nature of science, I realized that huge areas of experience have been excluded from the sphere of science because scientists, under the influence of the materialist philosophy, think the mind's nothing but the brain, matter's unconscious, the laws of nature are fixed, and so on. These are dogmatic beliefs which are usually held without people realizing their dogmas. Most scientists think, or at least most materialists think, that they don't think they've got a belief system or a worldview. They think they know the truth. They think other people have beliefs, but they know the truth. And this is as I became aware of the limiting effects of these dogmas, I began to notice more and more how many experiences have been excluded from science. And over the last 15 years, some of my research has been on what I call the mysteries of everyday life. The feeling of being stared at, for example, the sense of being stared at, which almost everyone's experienced. You feel you just turn around, someone's looking at you. Or you look at someone, you make them turn around. More than 90% of the population had that experience. Had been just ignored by science. It ought not to happen. If the mind's in the brain, you shouldn't be able to influence someone by looking at them. Therefore, it's just a superstition. It doesn't really exist. But you can do experiments so simple that a child can do them, and thousands of children already have done them, that show this is a real phenomenon. This has now been replicated in many parts of the world. I then found there are many things people don't know about animals. Lots of people told me stories about dogs that know when they're coming home. And again, when I discussed it with my scientific colleagues, they said, oh, these are stupid people, they're uneducated, they just wishfully think this is happening, they project anthropomorphic feelings onto their animals, and so forth. I said, no, but it's interesting, maybe it's true. They said, of course it's not true. So I did experiments where I filmed the place at dog waits, had people come home at non-routine times, randomly chosen by me or my assistant, in taxis or other unfamiliar vehicles to avoid familiar car signs. And over again, these dogs go and wait, sometimes half an hour before the person comes home, and they respond to their intention to come home. You can see a video of one of these experiments on my website, sheldrake.org. And I wrote a whole book about this and other related animal phenomena called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home and Other Unexplained Powers of Animals. And there are many other phenomena, telepathic phenomena, which everybody knows about, but which have not been investigated by science. So, for example, I've done a study on mothers picking up when their babies need them, where many mothers have found when they're away from their baby, when they're breastfeeding, their milk lets down, their breast tingle, they squeeze out milk. This is what happens when they hear the baby cry, but the baby's not there, they're miles away. Most mothers, when it happens, assume the baby needs them, and they go home or they ring home. And I found that they're right, way above chance. I've done a statistical study on this. And the phenomenon of telephone telepathy is one of the phenomena that's evolved along with technology. More than 80% of the population had the experience of thinking of someone for no apparent reason. Then that person calls, and they say, that's funny, I was just thinking about you. I've done lots of experiments on that which show this is indeed a real phenomenon. The subject has 4 potential callers chosen by them, people they know well. We film them while the experiment's going on. They have a landline phone with no caller ID. And we pick one of the 4 callers at random, ring them up and say, please call your friend now. So they call their friend. If you're the subject, the phone rings. You can't guess who it is from knowing people's habits because it's picked at chance. And before you pick it up, you have to guess who it is. I think it's Steve. You pick it up, hi Steve, you're right, you're wrong. By chance, you'd be right one time in 4, 25%. In hundreds and hundreds of these filmed experiments, people are right on average 45%. It's massively significant statistically, more significant statistically than the existence of the Higgs boson. So here's I've now got an automated test. I just launched one in Britain. It's not yet launched in America. So anyone can do this on cell phones. It could be an intuition training app. And I get similar answers at Google. A lot of people in that world are interested in developing apps based on these experiments. But that's the final thing I want to say, because that's really about making a bridge between everyday experience, which we all have. Everyone knows about the sense of being stared at, even children. Many people with dogs and cats know that their pets pick up their thoughts or intentions, including their intention to come home. Almost everyone's had these experiences of telephone telepathy, but because they don't fit on the mechanistic, materialist worldview, they're totally excluded from university psychology departments. There are whole groups of organized skeptics whose mission it is to try and stamp out what little research there is on these subjects, because they say it's pseudoscience. But here, I think what's happening is that all of us have been forced into a denial of our own experience in the name of an ideology, the materialist ideology. Most people know these things happen, and they'll talk to their friends in private about them, but they very rarely mention them in a university context, because if you say you experience these things or believe in them, you're immediately classified as uneducated, stupid, or gullible. And no one wants to be thought that. So educated people usually pretend in public to go along with the materialist worldview. Luckily, it's becoming less necessary to keep up that pretense as the materialist worldview falls apart around us. I think materialists have now lost the arguments. They still have the power. But as I showed in my recent book, Science Set Free, if you turn the dogmas of science into questions and look at them scientifically, a whole range of new possibilities for science open up. Well, I think that we're on the threshold of an extremely interesting era, because, as I say, I think these dogmatic assumptions of materialist science are flaking apart, they're crumbling. We're now inheritors of all the world's spiritual traditions. Never before have they all been available to anyone, anywhere. And I think a new era of dialogue is opening up, a new era of bridge building on the grandest scale, which has huge potential for the future of humanity. Just to give one final example, in cosmology, until the 1920s, nobody knew that there were galaxies beyond our own. And people didn't know that our own Milky Way was a galaxy. But then galaxies beyond our own were discovered. And now we've seen through advanced telescopes right back to galaxies 12 billion light years away, formed near the beginning of the universe. So what's the meaning of all this? From the point of view of cosmology and astronomy, this is just inanimate matter obeying mathematical laws. It's completely purposeless and has no meaning, and it's all unconscious. That's the standard assumption in physics. That's not being proved by science, it's simply a materialist assumption. The traditional religions haven't dealt with galaxies beyond our own because they didn't know about them. These are recent discoveries. The most grandiose, or at least grand-scale speculations about the cosmos are in the Indian tradition. They had a much bigger view than anyone else, but even in the Indian tradition, I dare say some people will find texts that point towards other galaxies, but this vast modern vision is something that the religious imagination has not colonized. It's simply been left out. The religious imagination, which can find meaning and purpose in things, is being left to the scientists who see no meaning or purpose in things. And as we explore the question, could these galaxies be conscious? Could the whole galaxy have a mind that includes all the stars as cells within its body, as it were? And those solar systems have minds and consciousness. And I have to say, some of these thoughts come to me from contemplating the sun, and I do see this as an answer to prayer from the Gayatri Mantra, which is an important part of my own practice, and also the Surya Namaskar, which I do every day. These stars and the sun itself can help to illuminate our thinking about the nature of reality, the meaning, purpose, and consciousness of this greater universe science has revealed. But nobody's done that yet, because the separate compartments of science and religion. So I think that bridge building is just at the beginning of what's possible, and I feel immensely grateful to Navin and Pratima Doshi, and also to the university here for creating this award, for focusing attention on the need for this kind of bridge building, and of course personally grateful for being given it this year. Thank you.
Magnificent. Krishnamurti, Reed Griffiths, so much. I'm very happy to introduce Mr. 1%. And this idea of morphic resonance is remarkable, and it's something that we all understand. Each of us in this room has influence far beyond just our immediate environment. And our next speaker, a physicist, who some of you perhaps have heard on NPR while he was running for president, will talk to us about his response to the great insights. And I think we all share a little bit of India in common tonight, which is wonderful. So, Dr. Hagelin, please.
Thank you, Chris. It is an honor to honor Rupert Sheldrake, our award recipient this evening. And his talk was just characteristically charming, insightful, inspiring. He has been a scientific hero of mine, and he's a few years my senior, although probably doesn't show. And reading his books was so stimulating. His ideas, somebody who just followed his curiosity wherever it took him. And based on what he saw with incredibly fresh and unbiased eyes, he would come up with ideas that just fit the data and make they're so self-coherent that they're just intuitively right. And yet, they weren't universally embraced. He captured the imagination and captures of millions of people, and has gotten tremendous praise by giants in the scientific establishment, but also some criticism, or skepticism, I should say. And the skepticism, of course, follows from ideas, and the main objection that has been raised sometimes to the ideas is they're not consistent with current scientific theory. Well, what worthwhile research is meant to be consistent with current scientific theory? The idea is to test, to probe the limits of science and to modify, or even amazingly expand, the context of scientific theory. And yet that's not always embraced very readily. There are the class of physicists who really contribute original ideas, such as Dr. Rupert Sheldrake and many other good scientists in the scientific community. There seems to be a subclass of scientists who, rather than propelled by the curiosity to expand the frontiers of scientific knowledge, somehow would rather simply cocoon themselves in the snug belief that they understand the universe, that everything about the universe is essentially understood today, except for perhaps a few details around the fringes that should be cleaned up. And they valiantly resist, they basically say, don't trouble me with facts, and don't, rock my scientific boat. And I must say that Rupert is incredibly intrepid, and he has invited and engaged in dialogue with some of the great giants of the scientific age, and some of the most incredible and stimulating dialogues that I think have taken place over the last decades. Fascinating. But he has also been willing to engage some of the most battle-hardened, barnacle-encrusted, staunch defenders of the materialistic status quo. And those are some of the most amusing dialogues and debates in the history of science. So as a scientist myself, or scientist in training that was back in the days of Harvard and CERN and Stanford, it was tremendous. First of all, the stimulation of the ideas, but also someone who was willing to just completely stand up for what seemed to be scientifically self-evident and yet not conforming to the scientific mainstream? Well, science progresses. And one of the most amazing myths and wonderful things that Rupert exposed in one of his later books, Science Set Free, is the pervading, what's the word sometimes, delusion of science. It's a persistent belief, generation after generation after generation, that the universe has been figured out. That we understand the universe finally, and yes, perhaps a few little details around the edges. And that belief has been shown to be wrong, generation after generation. And yet today, there's certainly many scientists, maybe most, many scientists who believe we have the universe figured out. So please don't rock the scientific boat. But really it should be clear now that the biggest questions, the most exciting questions, most profound enigmas are yet to be solved. The reconciliation of gravity with quantum mechanics, the unification of the fundamental forces, the nature and origin of consciousness, which is not only not yet nearly understood, but in the minds of many, taboo, a subject not to be even considered. And I certainly know, as a graduate student at Harvard, I was strongly discouraged by my advisor, Stephen Weinberg at the time. Don't even peek into that area. He said, it will ruin your life. Well, peek I did. But what is happening is that science does evolve. And because it is empirically based and evidence-based, empirically driven, it evolves sometimes rather slowly, but methodically and deliberately and inexorably moves in the direction of a more complete truth, more complete understanding. And with the benefit of decades of scientific hindsight, the ideas, the core ideas that Rupert was advancing long ago are no longer so enigmatic. And in fact, the evolution of science and quantum mechanics and entanglement and string theory and epigenetics are starting to give a glimpse and insight into the ideas and even a rudimentary understanding of the principles and mechanisms that may be driving morphic resonance and the morphogenic field and so forth. In quantum mechanics, quantum entanglement is understood more and more richly. It is this mysterious correlation among separated particles under certain circumstances, where they have an influence upon each other at a distance, faster than the speed of light, and yet somehow constrained by relativistic causality. Well, what happens there, it's rather mysterious. What happens there is, the evolution there is, that these correlations among separated objects, which Einstein considered incredibly spooky, so spooky that he abandoned quantum mechanics, are now probably not such a rare thing as many had thought, that they are the product of the result of very careful preparation, laboratory preparation. Now it seems, through the work of Aharonoff and colleagues at Chapple University and others, that these quantum connections, quantum entanglements, are ubiquitous. And that the material world is crisscrossed by these long-range entanglements. And for example, common understanding and mathematical models suggest that systems that interact frequently, objects that interact frequently, have a rich set of these correlations, which are real, by the way. They can be exploited in the laboratory of quantum computing and quantum teleportation to send vast amounts of information in this hidden, unmanifest quantum mechanical through these connections. And now it seems that these connections are ubiquitous. If you have a closely interacting system of objects, the connections, quantum, mysterious, long-range correlations among these will be rich. To put it in human terms, if you have a family that interacts frequently and closely and intimately, you're going to have strong correlations among family members, a strong imprint on your fellow family members, so that even at a distance you carry that feeling and you carry the connection with you. It's a physical thing through which information can be passed. Or a closely knit culture, a society that shares a common language, common culture, that is tuned into the same media, that interacts culturally. there should be strong correlations, quantum correlations, entanglements between such a society. And these entanglements are a web of information, an information field, a morphogenic field that gives rise to a collective consciousness and collective behaviors. It's something we know empirically. There's a lot of research on these phenomena. But now scientifically we can say, yes, it's okay, because we have the beginnings of a mechanism, an established quantum principle that shows that these phenomena should be real. And there's another thing I'll just mention in brief as I close about these quantum correlations that I think is very exciting as a string theorist, is that these are rather abstract, and they are an inevitable result of the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics, so they're presumably real. Many have doubted that they were real until they were put to work through quantum computing, quantum teleportation. Real but abstract. But these days, surprisingly from quantum gravity and from particularly M theory, we understand that separated objects and separated particles that are quantum correlated, that are entangled, are actually connected by relativistic strings. They are the actually endpoints of a superstring, an open string. And the string itself actually traverses a fourth dimension of space and allows for a physical connection and communication between its endpoints, or the particles. And to make it a little bit more concrete, these strings, as they evolve in time, sweep out a two-dimensional world sheet that has the topology and the causal structure of a non-traversable wormhole. So basically what that means is that there are wormholes or tunnels through space that connect distant but quantum correlated objects, which include all of us. And that's, I don't know if that image is as palpably concrete as I promised. Maybe not something you can sink your teeth into. But it does show a physical link where it had been merely an abstract sort of mathematical concept before. So as science progresses, the abstract becomes concrete, and the unknown becomes known, and the incomprehensible becomes comprehensible. And what's really amazing and beautiful about this award, and I think we all want to acknowledge the Doshi family for the vision and for the generosity to confer such an award. You know, there are many awards that celebrate scientific competence, scientific ingenuity, scientific achievement, scientific brilliance, but there are very few awards that celebrate the unconventional and the bold and the intrepid and the willingness to take the limits of science and stretch them to the point where it's not comfortable because it stretches the scientific status quo, and to build a bridge between science and spirit, to take the rather mystical realm of mind and consciousness and spirit and bring those, and not only mystical or at least abstract, but even taboo from a scientific standpoint, and bring them into the light of science. And openness, psychic anomalies, and all of it into the realm of scientific scrutiny and vigorous scientific debate. And Rupert Sheldrake has done that, really more than anyone I know, and has been therefore really a valiant driver of the progress of science. So firstly, I guess I would certainly like to acknowledge the great vision and generosity, coming up with an award that really rewards and honors the bridge building of the type we heard in such tremendous diversity in Rupert's talk this evening, as we also honor and congratulate our very esteemed award recipient this evening. Congratulations, Rupert Sheldrake.
Eric Strauss, a wonderful colleague, is building bridges, and one example of work that he's doing in his studies here of urban resilience is documenting the coyotes.
Thank you, Chris. It's a delight to be here this evening at such a special time. And I would like to add that one of the things I think the Doshi family is celebrating this evening, especially with our recipient, my new friend I met for the first time tonight, Professor Sheldrake, is really a profound courage. Because what we're really talking about is the willingness to move beyond the status quo and to move outside of the arena where it is safe. And in all of our professional undertakings, there is a safe place where we can be that, as best as anything can in our own careers, guarantees some level of advancement. But yet there are those forces that compel us internally that say, I could be doing better, I could be asking a different question, and I could be taking a bigger risk. And all of us in our careers go through this, and I'll be brief tonight because I have the unenviable position of standing between you and a reception, or at least the freedom of confinement in your chairs in this late. When I was a graduate student and studying animal behavior in Boston, this was in the 1980s, where it was radical to even think that different animals would have different personalities. And that male and female animals should actually have different desires to achieve different things based upon their ecology. And so we were doing radical things like putting radio transmitters on birds and coyotes and crows and white-tailed deer, and discovering that indeed age and gender and rank within your social group were important drivers. And so you began to get in the head of these animals and say, they must be thinking deeply and must be modeling their social landscape in order for them to have such rich and varied behavior that is so plastic and responsive. But when you ask your graduate committee in the early 1980s, what are these animals thinking and what is their level of consciousness? You are told to put that in a box and take it out only on weekends and on Christmas break. Because you have a thesis to write, you have a job to get, and you have tenure to achieve. And so I did, and focused our work for a long time on long-term longitudinal studies on the variation in animal behavior and reproductive success, and the kind of things that are the classic material of study of evolution and its function. But before long, I drifted into the field of ecology. And ecology, already at the ragged edge of the traditional biological sciences, because ecology, as you know, comes from the Greek word meaning oikos, or house. And ecologists are not studying the thing, they are studying the interactions among the things. Which is already has a bit of a Buddhist feel to it, doesn't it? It makes me a little bit frightened. And so ecology has grown immensely in the past 20 years because it is such a powerful tool of inviting interdisciplinarity and, in fact, transdisciplinarity. And the field of ecology I work in now is called urban ecology. And that work, which got its start in the Northeast, the United States, has spread rapidly across this country and finally got up to the fact that the Europeans were doing urban ecology since the end of the Second World War. It has become an extraordinary, vibrant field of investigation because it does, by its nature, have to shatter the conventions of traditional science. And I had the great good fortune about 4 years ago of being invited to come out to LMU and serve as a president's professor in urban ecology and start a new interdisciplinary center called the Center for Urban Resilience. And it's a particular sweet spot in your career where you have tenure and you're a full professor, and you're not quite at the point where they can ignore you and give you an emeritus status and shove you into a small office. So you have a narrow window where you can serve as a bridge builder and bring people into a community of transdisciplinarity where it's okay to think outside the box. It's okay to abandon convention. Because in many ways, the community you've invited into what would be our windmill have already demonstrated their capacity to play within the bounds and play by the rules. So haven't we gained the opportunity to challenge the rules just a bit? And in fact, when we think about what it means to have healthy communities, we're confronted with the fact that the past 100 years, in fact, really the past 50 years, has demonstrated the most radical shift in human demography in the history of humanity. 1.5 million people a week are moving into cities worldwide. Half the world's population now live in cities. In the developed nation, it's 80%. And of the next 3 billion people that are added to the planet, 95% will move into cities. We do not have a theory of the city. We do not even have relevant scientific tools that apply themselves directly to the challenges we see in the urban context. We're still forced to use words like sustainability, which suggests that there's a materialist stopping point in the nature of our understanding of the way in which cities work. Cities are dynamic. There's no sustainability, there's only transformation. There's only moving forward. There's only understanding our legacies in that it helps to shape our understanding of what it means to move with some bravery into the future. And so despite all the scientific tools we bring to bear, all the reductionist activities that we apply to our science, we like to say we're doing hard science because it maps on directly to the scientific method. Once you get into the context of cities, instead of saying, I'm doing hard science, we have to say, we're willing to ask the hard questions. Because if we're going to touch at all the notion of what it means to be a sustainable and resilient community, clean air, clean water, clean soils are nothing without a just and equitable social context in which people live. And so, in fact, the most important question that an urban ecologist can ask about their science or about their community is, how do people feel about living there? And the most important metric we can hope for, with all the scientific tools and all the diagrams and the metrics that we apply, we know we have it right when people tell us they love where they live. And loving where you live draws upon the most complex and deep and beautiful part of nature, most of which we've only begun to catch glimpses of what we will eventually compound into a material we call the truth. And so tonight's about courage. Tonight's about recognizing those folks who are willing to take that risk and ask their science to do new things that have not yet been tried. It's a delight to be here, and thank you again for a wonderful presentation.
People talk about academic freedom. I experienced in that atmosphere an extraordinary academic freedom. I think the fact that for people there was this spiritual framework was a very important part of it, because there was something that held us together that was beyond the merely intellectual and the mere clash of egos. But for me, it was one of the great experiences of my life, I have to say.
And you're at the right age at which you were at that impressionable moment in your development and devotion.
Yes.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. So in the Cambridge area in the 1980s, Harvard maintained an animal study site. It was an old Beaumont missile site just outside Boston and Concord. And it was a place that we would gather as graduate students and have these forbidden conversations. And that's where there was a scientist at the time, Donald Griffin, who was one of the early pioneers in the studying animal consciousness, had already become emeritus, and he had his lab there. And he would host these dinners. And we could come and have these conversations that were free of our graduate committees, that were clearly where we wanted to go. And this notion of preaching to the patients, you know, work through this process,
yes,
get your bona fides, and then challenge the system.
One thing, something you said today that I found incredibly important and that I would like to strongly support, but rarely ever heard it uttered. The fact, the vitality, the intrinsic liveliness of nature, the conscious of nature. Now, we have, after 300 years of exploration of the classical scientific macroscopic world, and you're studying macroscopic objects like this so much, you do get the impression after a while that you're living in a dead universe. You can. Now, if you're studying biology, you're studying a plant, maybe not. But if you're studying billiard balls, you do. But what happened, of course, is this classical exploration of the surface crust of nature eventually gave way to the study of the molecule and the atom, which is governed by a completely different language and logic called quantum mechanics, and then the study of the elementary particles and forces, governed by a completely different logic and language called quantum field theory, and ultimately the study of the unified field, which has its own completely different logic and language and mathematics. But every step you go deeper into the structure, the core structure of nature, the qualities of life and of consciousness start to really just abound. More intelligence, more dynamism because of the quantum principle, more self-awareness, self-interaction. And this is something that sort of occurred to me just looking at the nature of physics at deeper and deeper levels. It's something you just basically discovered and came up with. What motivated you to come up with the conclusion that nature is fundamentally alive?
I think my own experience. The reason I became a biologist is because I really loved plants and animals. As a child, for example, I kept homing pigeons. And I was fascinated by homing pigeons. The town I grew up in, Newark-on-Trent in Nottinghamshire, is more or less in the middle of England. And every Saturday, there were, at the railway station, there were these wicker baskets full of pigeons that had been sent by people from all over England and Scotland for racing. It's a sport in England. It is in the US, more on the East Coast than the West. And so all these pigeons had been sent by train, and then the porters at the railway station, they get out their pocket watch. I've got one myself. They'd look at it, and when the time came, say 8:30 a.m., then they'd open these wicker baskets, all these pigeons would fly out, and they let me help them. And they flew up into the sky, and they circled around, and they went off in all different directions to their homes. I was so fascinated by this, I asked everyone, how do they do it? Nobody knew. Then I kept homing pigeons myself. I kept them at home, and I wanted to see them do it myself. I put them in a cardboard box and went on my bicycle as far as I could, and then I'd release them. I'd cycle back home as fast as I can, and they always beat me to it. So I became intrigued by this, and the nature of life, you see. I mean, I was never, I have to say, that interested in kind of abstract formulae that I got in physics. And I was much more interested in the homing pigeons. I took this research up again when I was a fellow at Clare College, Cambridge. I had mobile pigeon lofts because I came to the conclusion they must be linked, but no one knows how they do it. The current theory is it's through magnetism. That's scraping the bottom of the barrel, because even if they have a magnetic sense, like if you were taken somewhere and given a compass, you'd know where north was, but not where home was.
You need a map sense.
You need a map sense, yes, too. So anyway, I was intrigued by these things about life, you see, and the science I was being taught, which takes the machine as the paradigm, is the very worst way to think about it. That machines are the only serious organised systems we come across that are not living and have no purpose of their own. And to use things that are totally not organisms as the model for things that are organisms seems to be so perverse. And therefore the idea of life within nature, and now the idea of life, the idea of Gaia, the earth being alive, and the sun being alive, and atoms and molecules having a kind of life of their own, appealed to me really strongly. And of course this is traditionally called animism. It's what most people in India and Africa believe. It's what medieval Europeans believe. St. Thomas Aquinas gave us a very highly sophisticated version of Christian animism in the Middle Ages. And so this just seemed to me so much better as a way of looking at things. I wrote a book called The Rebirth of Nature, which is about the new science and the revival of animism, it's called. Interestingly, this is now becoming the position that materialists are going into. Have you noticed how in the last few years materialists are jumping ship? First, Hagelin Strauss went over from being, he's an atheist British philosopher of mind, went over to panpsychism, the idea of the psyche or mind all through nature. Then, last year, Thomas Nagel, America's leading philosopher of mind, came out for panpsychism in his book Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. That caused a furore. And now Christoph Koch, who's the most hardcore materialist I met, came out for panpsychism 6 months ago in Scientific American. Sam Harris, one of the new atheists, has a book coming out now called waking up, spirituality without religion. He's gone over to spirituality and Buddhism light. So there's a huge transition going on right now. It's very interesting. There's hardly anyone. Daniel Dennett still chugs on defending the materialist worldview. But have you been noticing this shift yourself?
No question. And you know, in the sciences, we tend to rely on a belief in emergent properties. So, you know, consciousness is an emergent property of us. You get a certain number of cells that can make a certain number of connections, and now suddenly you're holding memory. And there's this mechanistic view that at a certain level of complexity, if this thing can do a certain number of things, we'll call it alive, otherwise we won't. And when you get to these fundamental transition points, it's so much more difficult to build a machine that is in the transition than to simply at least experiment with the idea that things like a living force or consciousness force are out there, and therefore complexity is tapping into an existing force as opposed to creating it whole cloth every time you achieve that kind of complexity. And it's, I think in some respects it's having the tools that allow materialist science to brave into that arena, because as the paradigms fail to describe, you have to come up with other descriptions, and it's moving closer and closer to a consensus.
I also see the same trend emerging in physics and mathematics as unified field theory comes to the fore, particularly superstring theory, Young theory. And the basic understanding, and Einstein was the first to really promote this, he didn't complete the job in his lifetime, and it's the major focus of theoretical research today, is that the universe emerges from and has in its foundation an ocean of intelligence, basically. Pure, abstract intelligence. And ripples on that ocean of intelligence play the role of particles, or ripples in the ocean of that intelligence, depending upon the frequency of that ripple, the wavelength of the ripple, will behave like an electron trap, or a quark, or a graviton, or a photon. So the whole world of the elementary particles is just ripples on the surface of this universal ocean of intelligence. And then those ripples combine into more complex packets of energy, which we call nuclei, atoms, and molecules. But from that perspective, the whole thing begins from an ocean of pure life. And the elementary particles, which we used to think of as some kind of concrete inert billiard ball, are just ripples, harmony on the surface of that ocean of intelligence. Nothing but intelligence in motion, pure life. And then from there, yeah, when you get precipitated enough and macroscopic enough, you have this ocean of intelligence tied up in a knot. Only then does it start to behave classically, and we think that it's inert matter. But even at the molecular level, that doesn't work. So I would say that the closer you go towards the source, the more the universe is nothing but life, an expression of intelligence and dynamism. And we don't, that's counterintuitive, because 300 years of studying the surface crust of life, which is the farthest removed from the ocean of pure life, you start to get the feeling that you live in a dead universe. But that myth gets broken, and quantum mechanics has disproven that. But it's sort of turning the whole situation on its ear. Instead of consciousness being an emergent property of matter, matter is an emergent property of consciousness. And it works so much better.
So we have time for maybe a question or two from the audience.
One of the main challenges when we're talking about bridging, one of the main challenges in our world today, in my opinion, is the problem of blind belief, and to think that my way is the only way. So I don't know what the solution is. I mean, on an individual level, each person can end that kind of thinking in themselves and respect other people's ways. But from a global perspective, if all Christians believe in John, I don't remember the exact one, where it says you can only go to God via Jesus, and if the Muslims believe that whoever is not a Muslim will go to hell, what do we do with that? I mean, the answer seems to be in education, in learning about others' ways. But I was wondering if you can comment on this.
Well, I think blind belief is, most people need blind belief in most things. We can't question everything, and most people accept science on authority. We accept most things on authority, but when blind belief becomes aggressive and it can become very toxic. And we obviously have said there's been a rise of religious fundamentalism in the 20th century and Islamic fundamentalism. What most people don't realize is fundamentalism is actually a fairly modern phenomenon. It's not what happened in the Middle Ages, in the Christian world. There was a wide range of methods and many schools of thought. There were the Franciscans, and there were Dominicans, and there were the Jesuits came later, and different ways of being Christian, different ways of doing it, monasteries, convents, and so on, and different schools of thought. Just as there are different schools of thought in Tibetan Buddhism and in Islam and so forth. The idea of a kind of one literal fundamental truth that gives you certainty was invented in America in the early part of the 20th century. Fundamentalism doesn't exist. Christian fundamentalism is a very, very American phenomenon. Islamic fundamentalism is again a 20th century invention. And it came about in response to dogmatic materialist science. And so scientific fundamentalism was a 19th century phenomenon. It's still with us today. The growth of dogmatic atheism based on the cult of materialist science didn't exist in the 17th century. Most scientists were practicing Christians or Jews and had a mechanistic view of nature, but a dualistic view where God and spirit were still there and religion was still there. So I think we have to see this not as a fundamental feature of religion, but as a 20th century reaction. And these fundamentalisms need each other. The Dawkins-type scientific fundamentalism needs creationists. He gets terribly disappointed if he's in a debate with an Anglican bishop. He accuses them of being an atheist because they don't believe what he thinks they ought to believe, something quite ridiculous that he can easily refute. I think that we have to see this as a new phenomenon, and of course one of the most toxic and dangerous beliefs of the 20th century was atheism in its form in the Soviet Union and in Maoist China. It led to more deaths than any other belief system in history. So I think what we need to do is obviously focus on the ground in between, where all the interesting questions are not at these poles of dogmatic belief. Although they have an important political influence, but most people are not fundamentalists, and most people are looking for new answers to the questions that the world presents to them. And I think those of us who are interested in finding those answers have to go on doing what we're doing. And I think many people will be drawn to this because it's more interesting than fundamentalism. I have a great friend called Rick Ingrassi, whose motto is, if you want to change the world, throw a better party. It's more fun to be exploring these things. It's more interesting not to be a fundamentalist. And most of them are doing it for defensive reasons.
I think it's also worth noting that I think a significant portion of fundamentalism, no matter how you want to divide it up, is a political strategy associated with the distribution and competition over limited resources. And so as we move in deeper into the 21st century, where wealth is being more hyper-concentrated, and we have communication systems so that people in different parts of the world are recognizing the growing inequality, even though global lifespans are increasing and things like that. But the inequality is increasing. Hyper-identities, fundamentals is another form of thinking about a hyper-identity, is a way of creating a stronger force against what people perceive as inappropriate distributions of wealth or distributions of knowledge. It's all quite dangerous. And the illumination of compromise is the way that this is diffused. If you're focusing on what we don't agree on, then you can hyper-identify. If you're focusing on what we do agree on, that melts away the boundaries. And so that's a powerful counterforce that can be implemented, but it's hard to do because it is our natural tendency to try and associate and cluster. I mean, it's a defense posture.
I'd like to add to that a thought. First of all, one can hope that even scientifically, as the scientific truth, the cutting-edge truth of the unity of life and the unity of humanity begins to pervade or trickle its way into education nationally and globally, we might have a whole different worldview in which we grow up. And then there's intellectual understanding of that truth, and then traditionally there's experience of the core unity of life. And this is where the great meditative traditions go. This is probably one of the reasons that you and I have both been driven to India in search of some of the deep philosophies and experiential traditions of how to open the awareness to the truth of the unity of life. But if we can leverage Dr. Sheldrake's principle of collective consciousness and the morphic resonance, and individually even, here and there, open the awareness to the experience of the core unity of life in the state of samadhi, experience of pure Atma, universal self. That has a very profound effect on individual physiology, individual neurophysiology, and brain function, but there is a spillover effect. There's definitely a spillover effect of an individual who is steeped in the experience of unity, calm, that spreads through a family, through a society, and that's due to the mechanisms of morphic resonance and core collective consciousness that has now been empirically tested in a huge variety of contexts. And one of those contexts is the effect of group meditation or meditating subpopulations on the surrounding population in terms of reducing crime and social violence and terrorism and calming open warfare in war-torn areas. It's remarkably powerful because we are all in this, really. We're in this soup of collective consciousness together. We're influenced by it, but we contribute to it. So we can hopefully leverage ourselves through the principles that you have articulated most clearly, and as create a seed of a transformation to a civilization in which the scientific truth of the unity of life, the bliss of unity, is a living reality in the life of the people.
I want to close by really thanking all of you for being here tonight. I want to thank the Doshis, of course. I want to thank Donna and Jen Wicks and David Rogoff and just so many, Jai, and all the folks who really worked on pulling this together. I invite you to come to LMU frequently. We have a wonderful pundit speaking with us tomorrow night at 8 o'clock on the 3rd floor, open to all. We also have Yoga Day on Saturday, so it's a full day of meditation and of yoga movement. We also have Raga Spirit the same day, which is an offering of 3 concerts of some of the best music to come from India, musicians top rated coming from India to us on Saturday. So if you have not given your name, please give your name, and we may once in a while be in touch with you. So again, thank you, and congratulations to Dr. Sheldrake.
Of course, thank you all of the whole audience, but I also, I guess, want to thank Aaron because Chris and Diana have always been with us